Good evening. I have the distinct honor of introducing tonight's special guest, Dr. Virginia Scharff. She is an incredibly productive scholar and teacher who has shaped the development of many fields, including environmental and women's history, as well as the American West. Dr. Scharff is a native of St. Louis, Missouri. While she lived all over the West, she currently resides in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with her partner and historian, Chris Wilson. Tonight, Dr. Scharff will help us understand what it might have been like or might be like if Roosevelt was a woman. Please join me in giving a warm Dickinson welcome to Dr. Virginia Scharff.
Oh boy, well, it is so exciting to be here. I cannot even tell you how happy I am. I am thrilled and incredibly honored to have the privilege of opening up this 13th annual Theodore Roosevelt Symposium. And I want to begin by saying a couple of words of thanks. First of all, to my old pal, Clay Jenkinson, who is Theodore Roosevelt Humanities Scholar, who has been trying to get me here for quite some time. And happily, finally, I'm able to be here. To Sharon Kilzer, who makes all of the wheels turn round and round and keeps all of the balls in the air, and to President and Mrs. Mitzel for warmly welcoming me to Dickinson State, and all of you who have donated to the Theodore Roosevelt Center, and to everyone who is here tonight to start this conversation among us. There he is, the man. It's been more than 35 years since I visited North Dakota, and last time I was here, as Clay has told you, I was traveling in the wonderful company of the NEH-sponsored Mountain Plain Chautauqua. You may recognize at least one person in those slides. That's our tent out there. I think maybe this is in, maybe it's Marmouth or maybe it's Hazen, North Dakota. Many of you have been lucky enough to witness Clay's virtuoso Chautauqua portrayals of figures as diverse as Theodore Roosevelt and John Steinbeck and Thomas Jefferson, of course. And some of you may even have attended some of the performances of our illustrious 12 weeks on the road, touring the Dakotas and Montana and Wyoming for the 12 weeks of that summer of 1981. And it was an unforgettable experience. It left an indelible impression on me. I have never forgotten the kindness of the people and the breathtaking beauty of this landscape here in North Dakota, the amazing, heady, not to say often contentious public discussions, or the deep feeling for history and for the public humanities that I found all over North Dakota. Now, I am now, as I was then, a historian of American women. And Carmen mentioned that I am a historian of women in the American West, the diverse women in the American West, but I've also written about the women in Thomas Jefferson's biracial family in this book, The Women Jefferson Loved. And that led a couple of years ago to a scintillating 2 hours of conversation with Clay on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, which is one of the most fun things that you can ever do, is to get interviewed by Clay for that program. And I know he has a devoted listenership, and I feel like I would have written the book just to be able to have that conversation. But in fact, my first book was about the ways in which women's use of the automobile transformed our culture and our American landscape. And it was in writing that book, Taking the Wheel, Women in the Coming of the Motor Age, that I first learned about Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who was a pioneering woman driver and a famously strong-minded, not to say cantankerous, figure in American history. And so I want to take the liberty of opening up here tonight by quoting my favorite Alice anecdotes. It's said that in the years that she reigned as a Washington hostess, she kept a pillow on the sofa in her parlor that was embroidered with the words, "If you have nothing nice to say, come sit here by me." That gave me a little insight into Alice's character. I'm sure you're going to be hearing much more about her from our other speakers. And it helped me understand why, when President Theodore Roosevelt was asked what did he think about Alice rampaging all across the countryside in a big automobile, he famously answered, he could run the country or he could try to manage Alice, but he could not do both things at the same time. Now, unquestionably, you'll hear a lot about Alice and about the other women in Theodore Roosevelt's family and his friends over the course of this illuminating weekend. You're going to hear about some of the kinds of things that President Mitchell mentioned, some of Theodore Roosevelt's most advanced views on the subjects of women, and probably also about some of his less enlightened positions, about the women whose works he read, and about the lives of the women closest to him. But I'm going to take a little bit different tack, just starting out here. So what I want you to do with me is to think both with and against the grain of history. Talking about women in history, I think, always comes as something like an interruption in the story that most of us have learned growing up. Because inevitably, the history that we learned in our elementary school classes, in our high school classes, that puts men in the limelight and in the center of attention. And of course, there is perhaps no man in American history, or I guess I should say wasn't until recently, who loved the spotlight more than Theodore Roosevelt. There's a story we were talking about, President Mitchell mentioned that Roosevelt wrote in his thesis that he thought women should keep their names upon marriage. Well, at one time when he was asked to give away the bride, it was his niece Eleanor, and she certainly did manage to keep her name after marriage. But when she married Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt gave away the bride, and he happily stole the show from Eleanor, who was notably shy and insecure. And Alice attended, and she was always ready with the acid quip, and she was heard to remark, "My father always has to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral." Now, even great women always seem to stand in the margins and hover in the shadows when great men like Theodore Roosevelt are on stage. And in part, this is because women have been denied access in some of the realms that men have dominated, realms like politics and art and literature, the battlefield, the business world, and the ballot box. And the novelist and poet Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, wrote that for her hero, Celie, young Celie, who had lived this terribly abusive life, to finally find herself and her soul, what she would need to do is not only triumph over the material circumstances that had kept her down, but that she would need to, in Walker's terms, get the man off her eyeball. Get the man off her eyeball, not have her vision so entirely clouded by what men did and said and thought about them that she would be able to see herself and be herself. And that was a tough job when the man was larger than life, like Theodore Roosevelt, but tough period because we tend to think of men as history makers and women as people who come along in their train. We do know that great men triumph over adversity, and certainly Theodore Roosevelt achieved greatness by overcoming serious childhood trauma and illness, making himself famously strong, and making his contribution and his mark on history as a reformer, a diplomat, a politician, and a writer. Theodore Roosevelt turned tragedy and loss into achievement, and he did this by having that confidence in himself, by holding on to the inextinguishable spark of genius that resided within him. He made his most enduring marks on the world through his histories and his nonfiction writing, and his zeal for reform as a public official. He was president of the United States for 2 terms, and this was an office barred to women in his time. Indeed, at the height of his political career, women had yet to win the right to vote nationally. But it wasn't for lack of trying. They were engaged in the fight for their rights all over the country. They were threatened and discouraged, and they were repeatedly warned that their efforts put them in danger, and nevertheless, they persisted. We know for a fact that there were many women, even then, who aspired to greatness, many who overcame childhood challenges They overcame opposition as adults. They were determined to be useful to society as far as their talents and their energies could take them. And they never, ever let the flame of their own genius grow dim. And so today, I ask the question, what if Theodore Roosevelt had been a woman? Given the constraints of womanhood at that time, what kind of life might a person like him, a person with his gifts and his ambitions and his broad curiosity, what kind of a life might a person like that have led? What kind of things might he or she have accomplished? So what I want to do tonight is tell you 3 stories about women who were born about the same time into roughly similar worlds as Theodore Roosevelt. Each of these women worked both with and against the limits she faced to achieve great things in her day. And their names were Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Florence Kelly, and Edith Wharton. I suspect that not too many of you have heard of the first or the second of these women. Of course, I'm guessing that many of you have heard of or read at least one novel by Edith Wharton. But I think all 3 women's careers tell us something about what it takes to make a difference in the world despite the burdens and barriers and constraints of womanhood. So let me begin with Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1860 into the illustrious Beecher family of New England. Her father abandoned his wife and 2 children when Charlotte was a baby, and she was left growing up in abject poverty. And so she and her mother and her brother moved around a lot when she was small, and her mother often had to rely on relatives who would take them in. And those relatives included 3 amazing great aunts. Catherine Beecher, who was a founder of girls' schools and an author of housekeeping manuals. Isabella Beecher Hooker, who was a pioneering feminist, and someone you probably have heard of, Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Charlotte Perkins grew up in the orbit of women who were doing great things in a time of great constraint in Victorian America. Her life, however, was lonely and unstable, and it was made even more so by the fact that her mother had been so wounded by her husband's betrayal that she forbade her daughter from even making close friends. She didn't want her ever to be hurt by intimacy. Charlotte was also forbidden from reading fiction, so she wouldn't get any romantic ideas in her head. Still, despite the fact that she was sometimes wretchedly insecure and isolated and deprived, she did know what it was like to be among women of strong minds and strong wills, and that can be a gift in itself. Now, moving around that much, she was hardly ever in school. She actually only got about 4 years of schooling total, and that ended when she was 15 years old. But she was an absolutely voracious reader, and so everywhere she went, she would go to the public library and read everything she could find. She loved every subject, from art to natural philosophy to history to literature, and she was particularly interested in art. So at the age of 18, she enrolled in the Rhode Island School of Design, and from that time forward, she started supporting herself as a graphic artist and a teacher and a painter. In 1884, she married another artist, Charles Stetson, and a year after that, she had her daughter, Catherine. I'm sorry, that's not who I want to show you. That's not Catherine. So they had a daughter, but Charlotte Perkins Gilman was not, despite the thought that Theodore Roosevelt had that women were born to be domestic and live their highest lives as wives and mothers, Charlotte Perkins Stetson was not cut out for a life of conventional domesticity defined by marriage and motherhood. And so after the baby was born, she suffered a really horrible bout of postpartum depression. And 2 years later, she was treated for what was then called neurasthenia by this guy, Dr. S. Weir Mitchell. Now, how many of you have heard of S. Weir Mitchell? We'll just see. We have a few of you out there. I'm looking, yeah. Yeah. Scholars, leave your hands down here. The presenters all know who Mitchell was. You're probably going to tell us more about him then, but I'm just going to mention he was a physician who achieved fame by advocating what was called the rest cure. And for women, that included these instructions. Live as domestic a life as possible. Have your child with you all the time. Lie down an hour after each meal. Have but 2 hours intellectual life a day and never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. Well, this was the prescription that Dr. Mitchell gave to young Charlotte Perkins Stetson, and the period of forced inactivity and isolation that resulted drove her absolutely stir-crazy. In fact, it nearly gave her an even worse nervous breakdown, and in 1892, she decided that the only thing for it was to memorialize that stultifying period in her life in a novella called The Yellow Wallpaper. It was published in the New England Magazine, and some of you may have read this book. In the book, her heroine is told from the point of view of the nameless heroine who is kind of stuck in this room up at the top of a house. It's a nursery with this figured yellow wallpaper on it. And in this story, this heroine has been absolutely forbidden to work. Although personally, she says she believed that congenial work with excitement and change would do me good. In the end, the heroine of the story goes stark raving mad and ends up crawling around the room thinking she has gone behind the hideous wallpaper and become entirely invisible. Now, The Yellow Wallpaper has become, in our time, a classic of feminist literature, and in fact, it is the best-selling book of all time published by the pioneering feminist press. And it depicts, I think, as few other books do, the psychic costs of treating women as weak and hysterical beings who require, above all, to be denied the right to pursue their dreams and ambitions. Now, by the way, if Charlotte Perkins Gilman had been, or Charlotte Perkins Stetson at that time, had been a man, Dr. Mitchell would have offered a different prescription indeed. Not a rest cure, but a West cure. They're saying it with me in unison. And when Mitchell treated the young lawyer, Owen Wister, the Philadelphia lawyer who was a longtime friend of Theodore Roosevelt, he prescribed his usual treatment for nervous men. Go to the Wild West, test your will, strengthen your masculinity. Mitchell had written in 1871 that under great nervous stress, the strong man becomes like the average woman. He recommended Wister visit a ranch he knew in Wyoming, and of course, as a result, as some of you may know, was the classic work of Western literature, The Virginian. And this was, of course, also the regimen that Theodore Roosevelt followed after the death of his wife and mother when he lit out for Dakota Territory in 1884. For her part, Charlotte Stetson soon decided that the cure for what ailed her was, well, actually, what Mitchell had prescribed for men. As Huck Finn said, she lit out for the territory. She separated from her husband and took her daughter to Pasadena, California, and that's her house there on the right, in the shadow of the San Gabriel Mountains there. And in Pasadena, she began to write and lecture and become active in feminist and reformist groups. In 1894, in an unusually bold move for the time, she got a divorce, and she moved back east to pursue her literary career and to work for women's rights and economic reform. And she would go on from this time to become one of the most celebrated feminist and socialist thinkers of her time. Gilman became active in the cause of nationalism, this was a movement that declared that it wanted to end capitalism's greed and distinction between classes while promoting a peaceful, ethical, and truly progressive human race. She earned her living on the lecture circuit But at the same time, she also developed a romantic relationship with her cousin, Houghton Gilman, and the two had a happy marriage from 1900 to his death in 1922. He was the kind of husband who did not mind that she was going to be out there lecturing, often absent from home, earning a living, helping out with just bringing home the bacon for the family. And in fact, if you think about it, her daughter is still growing up, but she managed to lead the kind of public life she did because she said and wrote that she believed that men ought to have close relationships with their children and that children needed to spend time with their fathers. And so as a consequence, Catherine's father was living back in Chicago, and Catherine was often with him and with his second wife, who Charlotte actually had fixed him up with. It was her best friend. So obviously, she led a highly unconventional life for her time. And that made her a controversial figure. But she had an incredible work ethic, a passion for social justice, a penetrating intellect, and the social and political connections that helped her win a wide audience and to be able to use to the utmost her gifts with the spoken and written word. In 1898, she published Women in Economics, and in this book she argued that that in order for women and children to thrive, there ought to be a more social or an even communitarian approach to housekeeping and child rearing so that women could be freed up to go to work in the public sphere. And this was a book that won her international fame. And then she began to publish her own magazine, single-handedly, The Forerunner. She wrote every word in it, nonfiction, short stories, and poetry, and published it herself for 7 years. The Forerunner stopped publishing in 1916, but she continued to produce literally hundreds of articles, essays, and stories for popular publications, and also books, including the feminist utopian novel, Herland, which was published in 1915. She called herself a humanist. Like Roosevelt and many progressive thinkers of the time, she also considered herself a Darwinist. But she thought mainstream Darwinism was too male-centered. Females, she said, also exercised a role in the process of natural selection. And they chose the most suitable mates they could find, and she thought male aggressiveness and female domesticity were no longer adapted to modern life. Instead, she said, men and women should have equal choice, equal access to opportunity. And she famously wrote that there is no such thing as the female mind. The brain is not an organ of sex. You might as well speak of a female liver. Now, at the same time, like Theodore Roosevelt, Charlotte Gilman embraced the so-called science of eugenics, which we now regard as a kind of tool of racial hierarchy. And Gilman and Roosevelt at that time argued that for society to progress, the better sort of people should be encouraged to reproduce, while so-called inferior people should be discouraged from doing the same. Now, this kind of logic led to some really terrible consequences when it was applied in practice, including in some places sterilization of women without their consent. So we can agree that there's much to admire in Gilman's life and work, as in Theodore Roosevelt's. But I think we also need to take a pause here for a moment and come to grips with the kind of racism at the bottom of this logic and the legacy that those kinds of ideas have had for us as Americans today. Now, if Charlotte Gilman envisioned a world in which women lived and worked and raised their children together instead of in isolated households, and that would give them the time and the support and the encouragement to enter public life, my second subject, Florence Kelley, who you see here, she found a way to live that life. She was born in Philadelphia in 1859. Her mother was a Quaker, and her father was a congressman, William Kelley, And he was a fierce abolitionist and so devoted to the cause of the abolition of slavery that he was one of the founders of the Republican Party in 1854. She was a sickly child, and she lived, of course, at this time, a lot of times people didn't survive early childhood illnesses. So she had 2 brothers and 5 sisters. All 5 of her sisters had died in childhood. I want you to just try and wrap your head around the idea that someone could grow up under those circumstances. And when you have that kind of loss, it is not that surprising that Florence Kelley's father, William Kelley, cherished his sole surviving daughter. And he did absolutely everything he could to nurture her gifts. So she got an excellent education, but much of it came directly from her father and from her Quaker relatives. She was very deeply influenced by her father's passion for reform and by the Quaker commitment to racial equality, workers' rights, and child welfare. She graduated from Cornell University in 1882, and she was one of the first generation of American women to attend college. And this was an absolutely remarkable development in the course of American society. All of a sudden, you start to have a much larger number of women who have access to and make use of higher education. And this remarkable social cohort left a rich legacy of path-breaking work in education, politics, literature, and social reform. Florence Kelley would prove to be one of the most stalwart and effective of that amazing generation. But as a woman, she faced barriers to getting the training and the professional standing that she needed if she was going to achieve what she meant to do. So when she wanted to study law at the University of Pennsylvania, she found that she was barred from going there on account of being a woman. Now, she was already embarked on a career in reform work, especially as an advocate of children in poverty. And so what was she to do? She decided she would go to Europe and see if she could get more education there, and found her way to the University of Zurich, where she entered a circle of socialist activists. She eventually married one of them, Lazar Vishnevetsky, and the couple had 3 children. And during that time, she also developed a really close friendship with Friedrich Engels. And in 1887, Kelley published her English translation of Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England. And this is the translation that is still considered the standard today. Unfortunately, Kelley's marriage turned out to be a disaster. Her husband was erratic and violent and piling up debt faster than the family could pay back their creditors. So in 1889, when they were living in New York, she fled this wreckage of a marriage, and she took her children and went to live in Chicago. She quickly joined reform circles there, and in 1891, she took her children to this place, to Hull House, the pioneering social settlement house that had been founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. And here you see, here's Kelley and Jane Addams, and this is Julia Lathrop, who was a labor activist. Hull House was the home to and headquarters for a thriving community of like-minded, highly educated and energetic women that included Addams and Lathrop, the pioneering public health doctor, Dr. Alice Hamilton, and now Florence Kelley. Hull House was located in a teeming immigrant neighborhood, and in that neighborhood, the settlement house became a center of social and political activism. At Hull House, working men and women and their children mingled with the daughters and sons of privilege. They taught and took classes, partook in festivals and celebrations, and they worked together to promote causes ranging from the crusade against municipal corruption, to labor organizing, to occupational safety, to child welfare, women's suffrage, and even street sanitation. Now, this is a picture of a glassworks in Chicago, and these children as young as the age of 7 were working in these incredibly dangerous and dirty places, and in some places, children even younger. Florence Kelley's particular causes were labor rights and industrial reform, particularly child welfare, as well as racial justice. And she did groundbreaking research in the area of social work, investigating conditions in the sweatshops of the Chicago garment industry. She conducted a survey of conditions in Chicago's notorious tenements, and there she found women working themselves to exhaustion and children as young as 3 in the tenements helping with this kind of outwork under really dangerous conditions. So she had to work, first of all, to just find out what was going on in these places, and then work to do something about it, to outlaw child labor, to crusade for the rights of children, to get an education, and to have the basic conditions that would enable them to grow up as healthy and productive adults. Now, she was a congressman's daughter, and so she came very early to the art of political persuasion, and she knew how to get people into the room and twist some arms. So she made it a point to take state legislators and other leaders on tours of shops like this so they could really see what was going on in these places. As a kind of recognition of the importance of her work, the governor of Illinois, John Peter Altgeld, who was a very crusading reformist governor himself, in 1893 did a really unprecedented thing, and he appointed Florence Kelley to be the state's chief factory inspector. This was a new office, and it was the first time that a woman had held this kind of appointive office in the state of Illinois and pretty much anywhere in the United States. That same year, the state of Illinois passed a law prohibiting women from being required to work more than 8 hours a day and banning child labor for children under 14. And this is in no small part because of Florence Kelley's tireless advocacy. She thought, in fact, that in order for the rights of labor to be recognized in society at large, one thing that you had to do was to recruit consumers to the battle. So, in 1899, she left Hull House, and she moved to New York City to the famous Henry Street Settlement House, and there she founded and served as General Secretary to the National Consumers League. Her logic was this. She thought that if people who bought the things that were made by workers who worked under these circumstances, if they knew what kind of conditions people were working under, and if they knew what kind of wages people were making and what kind of hours they were spending standing on their feet doing this work to produce the things that they bought, she thought that consumers would demand that the goods that they bought were produced under safe and humane and sustainable conditions for the people that made those goods. And it's interesting, this is the seal of approval of the National Consumers League, which was in fact the forerunner for the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. So you can see the kind of legacy of activism on behalf of workers, moving into a kind of connection between the workers and the consumers, and that was her contribution to really reframing labor rights in a new way. And in that same year of 1899, she also got her long-delayed law degree. She got it from Northwestern University, and so at that point, she begins to use her legal knowledge to push for protective labor laws. And by 1907, she used her national standing, expertise, and energy to get behind an effort to uphold protective labor laws for women. These were laws that would say things like, women can't be made to stand on their feet for more than 8 hours at a time working. It seems obvious to us at this point that people ought to be able to take breaks, that they ought to be able to go to the bathroom, that they ought to be able to get a drink of water, but these were not the conditions people were working under. And there was a case that was working its way up to the Supreme Court that had been, a law that had been passed by the state of Oregon mandating that women couldn't be forced to work more than 8 hours at a time. And it was a case called Muller versus Oregon. And so Kelley put together a team of researchers, including a lawyer named Josephine Goldmark, and they produced an absolute mountain of sociological and medical evidence to argue that working more than 8 hours a day would jeopardize women's health. And that argument was presented to the Supreme Court by their colleague on this effort, a guy named Louis D. Brandeis, who would be a future justice of the Supreme Court. And that, their argument became famous as the Brandeis brief. And this was the first time in the history of the Supreme Court that anybody had used this kind of sociological and medical evidence to try to make a point for the court, rather than just relying on kind of legal precedent. They're introducing other kinds of evidence to try to persuade the court, and the court bought their argument. But this was the first time, but far from the last, because one case you may have heard of that used this kind of evidence was a 1954 decision, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And so that was the court case that famously outlawed segregation in public schools and other public facilities. And it was Florence Kelly and her team and future Justice Brandeis who really brought this kind of thinking and made it available to people like Thurgood Marshall, himself later a justice of the Supreme Court, who argued the case of Brown v. Board of Education before the court in 1954. Now, Kelly herself was, like Thurgood Marshall, a staunch champion of racial equality. And in 1909, she signed on as a founding member of the NAACP. And in 1917, she marched in a parade in New York City, a parade in which all of the marchers kept absolutely silent. And this was a march to protest white violence against black people in a race riot in East St. Louis, Illinois. And so Florence Kelley was a crusader, a powerful voice in the crusade against lynching, an advocate of women's suffrage, protesting against the unequal treatment of black women by some of the Southern suffragists who wanted to prohibit black women from participating in the movement. Now, nobody messed with Florence Kelley. Jane Addams said of her that Kelley was the toughest customer in the Reform Riot, the finest rough and tumble fighter for the good life for others that Hull House ever knew. This sounds like something somebody could have said about Theodore Roosevelt. And if ever there lived a woman who conquered the disabilities of gender to use her genius to make a contribution and make a mark, surely Florence Kelley should be on that list, if not rising toward the top. Well, like Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Florence Kelley, Theodore Roosevelt left a legacy of reform activism. He was vocal, some even said exhaustingly noisy, in pushing for the things he thought mattered, in using what he called the bully pulpit to advocate for clean government and economic reform, and using the power of the state to fight injustice and support equity and opportunity. But of course, life wasn't all politics all the time for our man Roosevelt. He loved travel and books. He loved his family. He was a passionate reader and writer and seeker of adventure. And he began writing at an early age and had published his first book, The Naval War of 1812, when he was just 2 years out of Harvard. So over the next 37 years, he went on to write and publish dozens of volumes on topics ranging from hunting adventures on 3 continents to the history of New York City and, for better or worse, the conservation of womanhood and childhood. Now, Roosevelt, as you know, hailed from the pinnacle of high society known as Old New York. And that was a collection of wealthy families that traced their roots in the city to before the American Revolution. It was a world of privilege, but not necessarily a liberating environment for women who wanted to be something other than wives, mothers, and society hostesses. And in 1862, Edith Newbold Jones was born into that lavish, narrow world. And just to give you a sense of the similarity in the worlds of Edith Wharton and Theodore Roosevelt, this is the house that Edith Wharton grew up in, and this is the living room of Roosevelt's house. You might feel like you were in the same building. Now, Edith Wharton, by the time she was 4 years old, embarked with her family on an extended tour of Europe that opened her eyes and shaped her entire life. And in the course of a journey that lasted nearly 6 years, the Jones family settled by turns in Rome, Paris, and Florence, and visited Spain and Germany. They returned to New York in 1872, and soon, young Pussy Jones, as she was known, was enjoying the privileges of her life, studying French and German, and spending her summers in a mansion on the shore in Newport, Rhode Island. Barely into her teens, she was already writing with discipline and force. By the time she was 14 years old, she had finished a 30,000-word novella titled Fast and Loose. 2 years later, her mother had a collection of her poetry privately printed, and among the people who saw that work were the family's friends, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and William Dean Howells, who was editor of the Atlantic Monthly. It wasn't long before Howells was publishing her poetry in his magazine, and her work was beginning to appear in other outlets. Now, you got to think about being a teenager that is that confident in their gifts. And she was very lucky to have her mother's encouragement, and certainly incredibly lucky to have the kind of excellent connection she had in the literary world. But she, even as she is this kind of a disciplined, confident, passionate writer, she's also something else. She's also a young girl who's eager and, in fact, required to go about the business of finding herself a suitable husband. And so I love this picture of her, actually, with her terrible hat and her two little dogs on her, two identical dogs, looking like, andirons from a fireplace or something, sitting on her lap. She looks to me here about as unconfident as just about anybody you can see, somebody who's not really sure where she belongs in the world. It's such a stiff picture in so many ways. But she, at this point in her life, is on the marriage market. And she became engaged to a man, but he ended up breaking it off because his mother made him do it. She thwarted the match, she said, because of this is the rumor that the mother had made him break up the engagement because of an alleged preponderance of intellectuality on the part of the bride. And I think, this was a problem Edith Wharton had all her life. People just thought she was too smart. So she ended up hanging out with people who were as smart as she was, but unfortunately not marrying one. So she married a guy named Edward Teddy Wharton. He was a sportsman and a man about town. They married in 1885, and they took up the life that she loved, combining a devotion to house buying and decorating with a near mania for travel throughout Europe and the northeastern part of the United States. Now, as I say, Teddy Wharton was the farthest thing from an intellectual, though at first, at least, he was devoted to her and did his best to make her happy and in his way. So Edith was another one that I found out about when I was researching the rank of early women automobilists. And Teddy saw to it that Edith's car was fitted out with every possible accessory or comfort. And as he wrote to one of her friends, he said, I am no good on Puss's high plane of thought, but you will agree that no lady of talent is as well turned out as she is. And indeed, she was quite a dashing, fashionable figure. Teddy, alas, never had a real job, and as it turned out, he had some mental health issues that became worse over time. So he was entirely dependent on Edith's income from her inheritance and her earnings. And as she had before their marriage and would throughout her life, she was reading and writing, studying art and science and philosophy and literature, traveling almost relentlessly. And while they were married, she began to acquire a circle of devoted friends that included men who could meet her on her own level. People like Henry James, people like her, the guy she called her one true love, Walter Berry, who was her closest lifelong companion, a circle of very accomplished men around her that one scholar dubbed her composite husband. There's a thought for you, right? Think about how that works. Well, by 1890, Edith Wharton began to make what would become a very good living from her writing, and she was publishing nonfiction and short stories in Scribner's and other outlets, and working on her first major work, which was titled The Decoration of Houses. It was published in 1897. She was an incredibly acute observer of the social scene as ever there was. And she had a passion for the perfect anecdote and the illuminating, or in some cases, damning detail. Her nonfiction work included trenchant architectural analysis and criticism, travel literature like the book you see here, La France en automobile, published in English as a motor flight through France, which is absolutely delightful, and also doing some literary analysis. She wrote constantly, even amid the whirlwind of touring, especially in Europe, and lots of socializing. And I want to say, you know, I've thought about how did she manage this? How did she manage all of this traveling and writing and doing all these things at the same time? And I learned when I was researching Edith Wharton a long time ago that one of the things that she did was she wrote in bed, which, you know, hey, who wouldn't? Who doesn't? But she wrote in bed, and at one point, someone she was with she was fussing with people in a hotel somewhere and getting them to move her bed over to the window, and the person that she was traveling with just thought she was such a fuss budget for making them do that, but they then suddenly realized that the reason that she had done this is because she needed the light to write. So she had her ways, and she was able to achieve the conditions that she needed. At the same time, she didn't publish her first novel until she was 40 years old. So for any of you out there who think you've got a novel in you, it's not too late. Right? There's always time. And by that time, she was 7 years past a divorce that had ended a marriage that had long since kind of lapsed into dormancy. That first book, The Valley of Decision, was going to be the first of 16 full-length novels and a clutch of novellas that brought her enormous fame and commercial success, including the Pulitzer Prize winning Age of Innocence, published in 1920, and of course, that bane of high school English classes, at least in my generation of high school students, the grim novella Ethan Frome, published in 1911. Now, for my part, my favorite Edith Wharton novels are The House of Mirth, published in 1905, and The Custom of the Country, published in 1913. House of Mirth tells the story of Lily Bart, who was a New York debutante who somehow missed her chance on the marriage market because she was fussy and holding out for love. And as a consequence of not getting that husband at the right time, she starts to suffer a truly excruciating, long social and economic descent that ends tragically. And this is a devastating critique of a world in which women's lives and livelihoods are entirely defined by the men that they're forced to depend on. And Wharton's portraits of the people who play the game in this world are completely savage. The women are catty and venal, the men are cynical and predatory for the most part, and Lily is way too delicate a flower to survive this ruthless Darwinian competition for dominance. This book first appeared in serial form in Scribner's, and it became such a runaway bestseller that it was on the list for over a year, and I recommend it to you. It is deliciously tragic. My other favorite, The Custom of the Country, is a different thing altogether. It follows the adventures of an American ingenue on the make, and her name is Undine Spragg. Undine Spragg, note the initials. Undine comes from the town of Zenith, somewhere in the middle of the country, and her intent is to climb to the very top of the social ladder, leaving many casualties and taking no prisoners as she rises. Now, Edith Wharton, like Theodore Roosevelt, had a kind of ambivalent relationship with modernity, and on the one hand, she celebrated tradition and the eternal virtues and values, but on the other, she loved the vibrancy and the vitality and the mobility that our modern life affords us. None of her fictional characters more fully embodies that ambivalence than Undine, who is a kind of dynamo in virgin's clothing when we first meet her anyway. And she will, by turns, snag 3 husbands, a weakling scion of an old New York family, a haughty and negligent French nobleman, and their marriage starts to fall apart when Undine is bored as daylights, living in his family's chateau in the countryside, And she really ticks him off when she sells the medieval tapestries that are gathering dust in the family's castle. And finally, she marries an American arrivist industrialist that she had known way back when in Zenith. And this guy is a bajillionaire who shares her crass materialism and admires her unvarnished ambition. So to me, reading The Custom of the Country is like binging on the best highbrow television miniseries you ever saw. I really recommend it. These books, it is worth noting, were immensely successful, and she lived the high life they provided. Her literary friends were, it must be said, a little jealous. So when she had bought her first automobile, an elegant Panhard Levasseur in 1904, she traveled all over Europe in it with her chauffeur. And when she visited her friend Henry James at his house in England, and this is her here with James, she announced that she had purchased the car with the proceeds of her first novel, and Henry James allowed that with the earnings from his latest work, he'd bought a little cart to haul produce from his garden. Now, for all of her devotion to pursuing her art, Edith Wharton was quick to answer the call of patriotism. She'd moved to Paris in 1909. She'd sold her houses in New York. She established herself in an apartment, an elegant apartment in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. And with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, she felt it was her duty to serve the cause of the French in World War I. So she established the group, the American Hostels for Refugees, and in the first 12 months, she raised $100,000 to support the effort. And pretty soon, she was making repeated trips to the front at Argonne, Ypres, and Verdun, and she was touring battlefield hospitals and raising money for war charities and aiding refugees, helping women displaced by the fighting, founding a host of services to offer food and clothing and health care to refugees and casualties of the war. And she was working almost constantly at this effort throughout the war years. She said she was only sleeping 5 hours a night. And one of the things she did in order to benefit the American Hostels for Refugees was to get published a volume titled The Book of the Homeless. And in this volume, she solicited contributions from her distinguished friends, including Henry James, Thomas Hardy, Joseph Conrad, and Theodore Roosevelt. She spent the greatest part of this part of her life in France then, although she made excursions to Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Morocco, and England and Algeria. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 1921 for fiction, the first woman to win in this category, and that year she published her biggest seller since House of Mirth, The Glimpses of the Moon. All kinds of honors flowed to her, and everybody who was anyone came to see her in Paris at her house or at her house in the south of France, and that included an absolutely infamous, disastrous visit from F. Scott Fitzgerald, who showed up drunk and disgraced himself. She received an honorary degree from Yale. She was the first woman to be so honored, and the gold medal of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, but never, despite the efforts of her friends, the Nobel Prize. When she died on August 11, 1937, she left behind an immortal literary legacy and an archive of letters and other materials that will fascinate scholars for all time to come, and you're going to be hearing from one of them this weekend. In her 1929 classic, A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf famously wrote that in order for women to make art, they need a quiet place to work and $500 a year, or in other words, at least a modest measure of financial security. The three lives I've sketched briefly tonight serve as testimony to Woolf's insights, but also to something a little more, I think, to the sheer determination it took and takes for women to secure both of those things. Charlotte Perkins Stetson Gilman overcame the burden of a cold-hearted, poverty-stricken childhood in order to seize every opportunity to educate herself. She found a way to make a living doing the work that she loved. Florence Kelley enjoyed far greater emotional and financial security in her early years, but she had to escape from a terrible marriage and find a community of like-minded women in order to do her great work, the work she found so meaningful and so useful. Wharton was born into the greatest privilege of all. including the immense blessing of having a mother who made sure she traveled and studied, and a mother who endorsed her daughter's desire to write. Like Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Florence Kelley, Wharton too found that she had to get out of an unsatisfying marriage in order to thrive. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was, by all accounts, a devoted father and a devoted family man, but I think we can agree that he could fulfill that role without having to do a lot of childcare. And he had plenty of time left over for big game hunting and writing and ruling the world. Both Gilman and Kelley were parents, but in order for them to participate in public life, they needed to seek out or to create extremely unconventional social and financial support systems that freed up their time and energy from the very demanding job of motherhood. Now, Edith Wharton, for her part, never had children, and she lived as much according to her own desires and needs as seemed possible. You have seen the results, the library of her work. So I think maybe it's best to end with a question that reverses the one that I initially asked. I wonder, what if Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Florence Kelley, or Edith Wharton had been a man in her time and her world? Would Gilman have held an endowed chair in economics at Yale? Would Wharton have won the Nobel Prize that her friends thought she deserved? Would Florence Kelley have become a police commissioner, or become a governor, or perhaps even risen to the presidency? In her time, as we see, those things were impossible for a woman. And I guess we can ask a final question here. What about in our own? Thank you.
Thank you so much for laying the table for all that will follow here. We have some time for some questions. If you have them, please just raise your hand. I'm going to ask the absolutely obvious question. What if he had been born a woman? What happens to TR if the gender is reversed?
Well, all right, so the first thing he would have to do is survive a childbirth.
Right.
You know, in the event that he decided that he was going to go ahead and become a wife and a mother, as young women of his time and place were expected to do, that would have been the first thing that would have had to happen.
And his first wife didn't survive.
Right,
right,
exactly, you know. Now, let's imagine that if he'd been born a woman, I think he might have been. Let's imagine that he made different sets of choices based on his ambition and his talent and his passion and his drive and his energy. I think he may have been somebody like a Charlotte Perkins Gilman or a Florence Kelley. I don't think he would have been Edith Wharton. I think that life of itineracy for him, he would have been bored by it after a while. I think he would have felt like he needed to sink his teeth into something or maybe go kill something. I don't know. But there were, actually, I thought about this. I expected you might ask me this question. And I thought about, okay, well, who in the realm of killing things, or of shooting things, we'll at least say, would have been the person of this time? And I thought about Annie Oakley. As potential, you know, that penchant for showmanship. I mean, all of the things that we celebrate Theodore Roosevelt for. But the one thing that I find really interesting about Annie Oakley is she was a hunter. She did like to hunt, particularly birds, but she did mostly target shooting. And when she was in the Wild West and doing shooting competition, she wasn't doing competitive shooting of live things. And I went to look at her archive at the Buffalo Bill Center in Cody, and I found not one picture of her shooting anything that bled. And so, you know, I find it interesting, you know, so maybe she did kill things, but they just didn't take pictures of her doing it.
Wasn't part of the public relations for the
Not
Wild
really,
West.
no, yeah.
But so these women that you've described are great women of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Does the list just go on and on? In other words, what do we need to recover in women's history? Several of us in the audience have not heard of all these characters. So I take it one of your views is there's a lot more excavation to be done.
Oh, there's so much. I mean, you're going to get a feast of this when you hear from Stacy and Kimberly and Catherine. over the next 3 days, and people who were, close, even just in the circle of Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, you will find legions of such women. And what is amazing about this period, and what is so much fun, actually, about studying it, is that this is a period where you start to see them really rising into public visibility. Because, as you know, when I wrote about the women in Jefferson's world, the women Jefferson loved, and yes, there's some sex in it, but it's not exclusively about his sex life. This is a time when women are so encompassed, for the most part, by the demands of private life, and by the stricture to be silent, and by the so-called doctrine of coverture, was stipulated that a woman disappeared when she married a man and became legally invisible, or by the strictures that say a woman should suffer and be silent, or be silent in church. That this is a period when even a guy like Thomas Jefferson, who believed that all men were created equal, thought that he had, the obligation to keep his family secure from public life. So he thought the good thing to do was to just keep those worlds absolutely separate. In the time of Theodore Roosevelt, the worlds of men and women are beginning to converge, and that's why there are legions of these women. And I thought about it as I was sitting down to write this. My rule is you only tell 3 stories in a lecture.
Right.
I could have told 33.
Of course. Just a couple more, and then I want to turn to the audience. But TR liked Wharton. They corresponded. They were friends. They were close, and mutual admiration. I'm sure she didn't like everything about him and vice versa. But the other 2 sound like women that TR would chafe a lot about.
Oh, yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about what that means, patriarchal disdain for rebellious, strong, creative women?
Oh, boy. What a timely question. I guess what I would say about that is, in particular situations, women find themselves having to suppress the urge to seek male approval in order to be able to achieve what they need to be able to achieve. And I think the problem with somebody like Theodore Roosevelt, or that voice, the man on the eyeball, that disapproving voice, that the lecturing, hectoring professor in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, that the women at that time had to find a way to censor out that voice, just not to hear it, to not hear that criticism in their heads. And one of the ways that people like Gilman and Kelly did that was by seeking communities of other women who were like them, who would support them rather than denigrate them.
Now, I know you don't claim to be a Roosevelt scholar, so I'm going to put you on the spot just slightly, and I know that you know that Stacy Corder is in the room. But so here's Alice, as remarkable as these women in strength of character, energy, intellect, drive, charisma. She chose a much different path. What do you make of that?
I would say it takes all kinds. That's just, that's a fatuous thing to say in a certain way. But I think Alice, in many ways, Alice was an individualist. Alice was not, these women were all socially conscious. They were avowedly feminist. They were people who, maybe despite the challenges of their childhoods or whatever, not Wharton so much avowedly feminist.
The other 2, yeah.
The other 2. But, I think with Alice, so much of Alice is about malice, it seems to me, and about a kind of a desire to one-up people. And Stacy can say a whole lot more about how that works than I do, but I just, I kind of admire those cutting remarks. I think that they're smart and witty, but I find them personally painful if they were aimed at me. And so, I think that they're, I saw actually on the internet somewhere today, somebody pulling out that old idea of, well, women never stick together, women don't really like each other, they can't work together. And I think that the stories of Kelly and of Gilman give lie to that canard. And I think that, maybe Alice just wasn't that kind of woman.
I want to say before we go on, there's going to be a book signing right after this, and so you'll be signing a number of your
Stacy,
books.
tell me if I'm completely wrong about that, but, you know, I'm wrong.
Here's a question here. Go ahead.
How significant were women who were silently behind their men who rose to power, fame, and
So the woman behind the great man, how significant were women who were silently behind men promoting their greatness and achievement?
I think that varies a lot. You know, I mean, if you think about, there are going to be some women who are the, you know, whatever, the power behind the throne or whatever, and you could name, you know, 50 of them if we wanted to sit down and try to lay out the names of some of those women. But I think you can just as often find women who are problematic partners for their husbands. So if you think about somebody like Mary Todd Lincoln, you know, that's not somebody who's helping Abraham Lincoln get the work done, right? On the other hand, you know, the idea that behind every great woman, or behind every great man, there's a, you know, the little lady at home. I mean, I think that many men who have had estimable public careers have taken for granted for generations and generations and generations that their lives will be made easier by women who manage an enormous array of things that they do. You know, whether it's making sure that their shirts are starched, right? Or whether it's making sure that their children are properly taken care of and educated and encouraged and disciplined, or whatever those things are. So it can range from that to being someone like Abigail Adams, who's a business partner and an intellectual partner of John Adams. So it's going to be all over the map.
Other questions? Yes, here.
Do you think if Teddy Roosevelt had been a woman that he would have gotten divorced, given his character, like the women you've been talking about tonight?
You know,
Divorce. Would TR possibly have been divorced had he been a woman?
Yeah, would TR have been divorced had he been a woman? I think, boy, that's a hard one to say, and I was worried that since I gave you 3 divorcees that we were going to run into this problem. I think it was possible also for other, you know, there were people like Carrie Chapman Catt, you know, who had a very large public career and who was not somebody who, you know, ended up having to end a marriage, or some others who never married. There are many women of this first generation of college women that just never got married. Jane Addams was in relationships with women. You know, would he have been in a relationship with a man? You know, I mean, knowing how he was, you know, maybe him and Owen Wister would have been a little closer than even they. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Wow.
You know, people.
There we go.
All right, now there we are.
There we go.
Time, get the hook.
No, not the hook, but hang on. But you had to do it. Other thoughts or questions? If I'm missing you, just shout out. Yes, here.
So you're a very accomplished woman. What did you have to do in this world?
How did you rise to greatness?
You know, the first thing that I did was, I think, you know, I had really encouraging parents who were really proud of my desire to read and write and think and study and learn history and do stuff like that. And they, when I wanted to go to college, they absolutely encouraged that. And although neither of them had graduated from college, so my generation I had 5 brothers and sisters, and we all, you know, went to college. When Yale went co-ed, you know, I said, that's where I want to go. And my mom said, no. And my dad said, couldn't you just like maybe go to Wellesley or something, you know? And then my mother thought that New Haven was really too urban for them. I grew up in a suburb of St. Louis. But then I got in and they just said, okay, you know, we'll make this happen for you. And so I'll give them a lot of credit for encouraging me and for making me think I could do whatever I wanted to do. And after that time, you know, I guess they gave me enough freedom, you know, enough rope to hang myself in some instances, but also to try things like, you know, signing up for some crazy thing that went 12 weeks across the Great Plains. So I'll give my parents the credit.
But I know that raises such an interesting question because you sort of hinted at this. So the way we look at these individuals who had to struggle to get out of the box of gender construction in their own time, and at some personal cost, divorces and
Yeah.
brokenness and
Right.
loneliness and isolation, poverty probably. And we like to think that now everything's fine.
We do?
Well, that's what I'm asking. So that's what I'm
Yeah,
asking,
yeah.
which is, how do you, as a historian, I know you have opinions as a human being and
Yeah.
a woman and a citizen, but as a historian, how do you contextualize that? I mean, we're this week with this whole Kavanaugh thing, we're going to see a really interesting moment in American culture, and whatever you think about all of that, it sort of is going to ask, does a woman have a voice that we feel compelled to hear? And I think there are some people who are going to say yes, and other people who are going to say no. But it would be hard to think of a man whose voice we would not feel compelled to hear in the similar situation. So try to
think
assess
that's
that a
true.
little bit.
I think that's right. Well, I'll go back to my original point, and I'll to my original point, and actually to my sort of closing statement here to Virginia Woolf, In a Room of One's Own, which is a remarkable book. If you haven't read it, it's one of my favorite books of all time. The first word of that book is but. Okay, but you will ask. $500 a month in a room of one's own, what has this to do with women in fiction or women writing fiction or whatever? And so women's voices always come as an interruption.
Even now.
Even now, we interrupt this confirmation to bring you a voice from the past, whatever that story is. I interrupt this march of an unending number of, or whatever, 44 men to the presidency to dare to run for the presidency. And people will say, well, that is a shrill sounding voice. Boy, I really hate her laugh. Well, she's certainly awkward, isn't she? And so I think we still have a kind, and maybe people do feel that way, but I think it's so baked into the cake of how we think about women's right to speak and to assert authority and to take up space, in our lives, in our world, in our public culture, that this is a battle that's not far from over. And I think we have to see it fought again and again and again. And I've been writing about women's suffrage for years, as you know, and writing about women's rights and all the different kinds of things that we think are, now settled, right? Settled law, whatever. And I think that any one of those things can go away. Things we think were accomplished 50 years ago or 100 years ago can always be reversed. And so I've been in a conversation with an editor about writing a book called Fragile Freedoms that is about the ways in which things we thought were settled for women are continually being thrown up for grabs again. So, I mean, the good news is that for historians like me, it will give us more work. More stuff to say.
Do I see one last question out here? Yes, go ahead.
Based somewhat on your parents' support, because growing up in the 60s, most of the history, a lot of history and reading history was coming from male voices. And so I'm curious, what kind of history, what was global history, was American women history, what was the history?
What was the reading that set you on your course?
Well, I mean, I have to say that, I started being interested in Thomas Jefferson from the time I was, 7 years old, and read my first chapter book, which was one of those orange cover landmark history books. If you guys remember those on the show, they had Claire Barton introduced, interested me too. But it was that thing about, Thomas Jefferson boyhood, Virginia boyhood or whatever. And so I was fascinated by biography. And I think I was really inspired to study history because I loved reading biography. And then I began to read in college. I had the incredible luck to take a college seminar with Gary Wills, who was at that time writing his Inventing America, his book about the great book about the intellectual history of the Declaration of Independence. And each of us he was reviewing every book about Jefferson that was coming out in that bicentennial year. And so he just brought into the group of 10 of the students, there were only 10 of us in this class, a stack of these bound galleys that he had gotten as review copies for the New York Review of Books, and he doled them out like playing cards, and he said, "You guys write reviews for me." You know, I'm not going to publish those reviews, but that's going to be your term paper. And the book that he gave me at that time was Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History by Fawn Brodie. And that was a period when that book was pilloried by the Jefferson establishment.
She was denounced by everybody.
She was denounced by everybody. She'd already been denounced and indeed excommunicated from the Mormon Church for her biography of Brigham Young. But, you know, and so I wanted to hate this book. And I thought, boy, she can really write the heck out of a sentence, you know. Boy, this is fascinating. Gosh, I want to read more of her books. And as time has gone on, I've really come to have an incredible admiration for her as a kind of path-breaking woman historian and biographer who took risks. I mean, she did a biography of Thaddeus Stevens, who was a Pennsylvania abolitionist, Republican congressperson, leader of the radical Republicans, at a time when Thaddeus Stevens was treated as the villain in the story of Reconstruction by people who thought that the South had been badly treated and should be restored to regular order. And so she took a lot of risks, and she was an incredible literary craftsperson. And so, I mean, those are the kind of books, somewhere along the way, a lot of times with books that influence you, you don't even know they're influencing you until 10 years later. So, you know, but I'll start with those landmark books on the fourth
Well, and
grade
Brodie
shelf.
wrote a Richard Nixon and a Richard Francis Burton. She wrote a number of very courageous books. But for what she said about Jefferson, she was denounced, and there were threats, including death threats. She was disinvited to conferences. People thought she was a sensationalist. And if you read the book again today, almost every one of her allegations holds up. In fact, has been validated. So that's my last question. Why is it that when this kind of a voice comes, Fawn Brodie saying, let's take a closer look at someone like Jefferson, and let's not be afraid if some things come to the table that are troubling or paradoxical or put him in less than a favorable light. Why is it that for everybody, but particularly for women, that's seen as so subversive and it encounters such violent hostility?
And it's also somebody who's dealt, but also somebody who's dealt a lot with men who were not ideal and didn't always have a thing. You mentioned she wrote The Devil Drives, right?
That's her.
Right, and she talks about his wife who loved him dearly, loved him so much that she burned most of his papers because they were those of a true gentle person. Right.
Well, I mean, I think that questioning conventional wisdom is a risky business, and you know, so and particularly for women who, you know, in patriarchal society are not particularly held to have wisdom of their own, and so that's where, you know, there is a certain effrontery for a woman to claim authority as you know, an arbiter of history or an arbiter of political power or any of those kinds of things. And this is unfinished business. We know it's unfinished business. We know that there are people who are profoundly, profoundly threatened by the idea of women exercising power or exercising even independence. And so I think, you know, we will see, I think, in this midterm election, we already know that there are a record number of women running for office. I think we are likely to see many of them win. In many cases, they're running against each other. So, you know, whoever wins, for example, in the 3rd District of New Mexico, they will have a congresswoman for the first time ever in history. Will this make a difference? I suspect that it will. I've seen some data recently that indicates that the subjects that people in Congress talk about are very divided by gender. So you see men in Congress talking about very different things from women, and the number one thing that women talk about is health care. And the number 2 thing that they've talked about on the floor of Congress is education. And for my money, having more attention to those issues is not a bad thing. So,
Virginia, we want to thank you. I think if Roosevelt had been here, he would have said to you, some of what you've done makes me uncomfortable and annoys me. But I'm going to go read all those books and get back to you. And he would have read them by October 1st, and you'd be in for the fight of your life.
and I would love
Virginia
it. I would
Scharff.
welcome it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sharon, come on up. Book signing in the lobby right now.